you demonstrated the need that you have for the positions that you have, but the bottom line is the dollars aren't there. And everyone knows this in every aspect of the county, that the monies that were flowing are no longer flowing. And I think, you know, it comes down to this critical decision making. And so if you have a premise from which to go forward to, you know, work things out with the DA, work things out with probation, work things out with once again, HHS, or any other division or department, I'd like to hear how we're going to go forward. If you can find $1 million working with them, great. But if you can't, we're stuck with figuring out where that million's going to come from, and it's going to come from layoffs that, on top of layoffs, the ones that are already happening in Health and Human Services Agency. I hope it doesn't need to be that dramatic, because I think we're trying to contain that kind of activity for the short run. It doesn't make sense to have agency-wide layoffs. What we were told a week ago was it was in the 40-some range of positions. And I said, wait, stop, hold it. We need to hear from the departments. They need to be accountable for their budget units, and creating 40-some layoffs with the triggering of bumping rights under labor contracts, to me, didn't make any sense. So we're back here with trying to get specific information and specific action plans from each of these departments, yours being the largest one, of where we go from here. And I haven't heard from your presentation. To me, again, I mentioned to you before the dual sides of the equation the other departments looked at. Activities, necessary activities, mandated activities, and dollars available to provide those services. So I'd like to hear more from you on how you feel we're going to reach that number.
Supervisor Smith, you're my friend. I respect your wisdom. I respect your leadership. However, you're saying words that I wish you had said in August when our budget was approved, and I stood here and said our budget is not funded appropriately.
I voted against the budget.
I'm sorry.
I voted against the budget, if you will recall.
Okay. I wish I had heard the words, Supervisor Smith, because I stood alone saying I will be back in February, and no one said, well, wait, why are you going to be back in February?
Right.
They understood that I was going to be back in February. And so when Nash Gonzalez, who I have a great deal of respect for, he made an interesting comment today that his department is economic driven. And I challenge you to compare that with law enforcement, because that's economic driven also. You've seen the numbers of the increase of house robberies. You've seen the number of the increase in crime and the increase of jail population. And these are numbers that I can't say, well, all right, boys, 20% of you are out of jail today because I have to cut my budget, because the judges have said you're going to be spending time in jail. And so there's a lot of expenses that I have absolutely no control of. And it's very important you understand that the sheriff has absolutely zero control in negotiations with any labor unions. The sheriff is excluded, and the only thing that happens is when the contract is negotiated and the final ink dries, they tell me what happened. And so the costs that I have here are static costs that I know it's going to cost this amount. So if the Board of Supervisors chooses to lay off deputy sheriffs, then so be it. The Board of Supervisors has made that. I've said I don't want to lay off any deputy sheriffs. I think it's detrimental to public safety. I think it sends an incredibly bad message to the public, to the tourists that come here, and to all of our citizenry who pay taxes and expect decent public safety.
So, hearkening back to those budget discussions, prior to ever getting into the boardroom, I went to both you and Tom Mitchell and said, let's agree on numbers. I don't want to have like my 4th year of budget where we get into this room and the numbers are not in sync. So I went to both Tom and Tom, and none of that ever happened. So I asked both of you to reconcile. I even went to the auditor, and that didn't occur. So there was activity on my part prior to us getting into the boardroom. And you're right, no one raised that issue when we were sitting here. But I think that, given that you've done some budget curtailment or expenditure curtailment, if it wasn't for the economic downturn that no one predicted the severity of, we would only be talking about $1 million, and probably we would find the wherewithal here, and we wouldn't be talking layoffs countywide to balance the budget. So I think the extreme times have to be superimposed on that discussion. And I think that really explained. I mean, 1.1 million in terms of your overall budget is significant, but it's not, it's one small percentage of it. So I think that if we wouldn't have had the activity after we passed the budget that we've all experienced with respect to the economy, I don't think we would be that far off. But what I'm looking for is how far can you go? What can you bring us of where you can cut? Because if it's not you, we're going to all of your colleagues that you're saying you're conversing with and working with, and they're gonna have to find it. I mean, we're gonna have to direct that it's found. So your presentation didn't bring us, there's no number. I mean, you haven't said it's 200,000, you haven't said it's 800,000, you haven't given us a number. And I think before we can move on to the Covelo deputy issue and the other kinds of concerns that you have, we've got to resolve this $1 million shortfall, because none of those topics involve the 1.1 million.
Actually, they do. They do, because if we had deputy sheriffs in Covelo, I assure you that my overtime would be drastically reduced.
Well,
it goes without saying.
We'd need to see a spreadsheet on that, the calculation of what it costs.
We need to, we need to move this forward here. That the budget shortfall is roughly $1.1 million. But Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong here, if we reduced because our contingency amount was not included that, but if we deducted the contingency amount, that would roughly bring that down to about 50%, right?
Allison Glass, the Assistant CEO. If I might be allowed to actually go to the next step here, and we can walk through, actually Supervisor Smith did a very good job of itemizing, but we can
Well,
talk
what we're
about how
trying
that
to do
works.
is we're trying to resolve this issue and request the sheriff ask for before
That's
we
exactly
move
what
on.
we need to do.
Can we get public comment, maybe?
That's
Okay.
the next step in this process.
You or Jennifer answer my question, no?
The
The contingency amount was included in the budget overrun, right? That contributes. So if you take and use your contingency funds to put it towards your budget shortfall, that would reduce your budget shortfall to around $550,000.
No, the contingency fund is already included. Your
Right.
net number is $907,000 is the overrun of the shortfall. Again, projected estimated numbers.
Okay, so the contingency was included.
It's already
in it.
included.
Okay. We need to still stay on track here with the issue of what the sheriff's request. You know, right now, presently, we have a hiring freeze, which in my definition doesn't allow the sheriff's office to hire Covelo deputies, animal control officers, or even corrections deputies. That's where we are right now.
Well,
Do we want to deviate from that?
well, I think you could ask the executive to comment on whether the hiring freeze, so-called, includes or does not include those positions. You know, there were
Well, I
positions.
think the CEO's office is looking for our direction.
Right. But
You
I,
know,
al-
we're the one that directs the CEO's office to have a hiring freeze. He's the one that said, well, actually, really, there's no such thing as a hiring freeze. It's really a soft freeze, which we all agree upon. But now the discussion is between the five of us, just how soft is this freeze?
yes, and before we get there to making those final determinations, I do think we should see if there are members of the public who want to comment.
I just keep in mind, board members, we're going to come to a decision of that here
Yeah.
right away.
Yeah, and
Members of the public want to speak on this?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm Krista McMenemy, your GSA Director. I just wanted to make a couple of comments that Sheriff Allman had discussed earlier. One being that risk management does have a service level agreement with the Sheriff's Department, which is a cost savings to the county, and we really appreciate his support and his efforts in working with us to do the driving program for the county employees instead of having